Yeah, we love to be in every province in Canada. So if anyone's listening, I think we're happy to have that conversation. So I think this will be inevitably a universal approach. I think it is, and everyone will get sequenced out inevitably at some point.
Hi, my name's Lester, and welcome to another episode of What's with RWE, the Canadian Healthcare Podcast. Today, we're super fortunate to have a real pioneer in the genomics, or specifically the clinical genomics space, on the podcast today, Dr. James Liu. He is the co founder and CEO of Helix, probably one of the coolest companies out there. James, welcome to the podcast.
Lester, thanks for having me.
Excellent, excellent. So I'm of course biased in that I think genomics is one of the coolest things out there, if not the coolest thing, specifically in biotech. But maybe you can let everyone else know, these billions of people hopefully that are watching because you're on the podcast. Who is Helix? What does Helix do?
Yeah, yeah, happy to. Thanks for the time and thanks for inviting us. Um, Maybe the first thing I'll just start with is like, what do we fundamentally think the role of DNA is in healthcare, right? And you'll get to how Helix kind of plays into this over time. But I think the key piece that we often think about is what is the foundational data sets that will exist in the future of healthcare? And our view is genomics is going to be one of these big foundational data sets because it's the only thing in healthcare data that doesn't change with time. So if you could generate a sequence one time, attach it to a person, use it many times in their lifetime, it'll be informative for a wide variety of purposes. And every one of those purposes drives both better outcomes and efficiency in the healthcare process, particularly if you digitize and use it in that way. And so Helix is kind of animated by that idea, this idea that the genome is going to be used for many different parts of healthcare over time. One of the core parts of it is the digitization process drives speed to answer, it drives lower cost over time. And the third piece, obviously, is that as you drive novel research in genomics, which many, many organizations across the world are funding, those applications now become digital capabilities over time. You can just launch them directly on an existing data set on a go forward basis. And so we think there's a ton of interesting things you can do both today, but also in the future. So Helix is helping organizations reach that future. And so most of our partners think of genomics as a core part of their operating system on the go forward basis. So our partnerships, say at UHN, for example, or many of our health system partners in the US, have this view as this is a data stream in our operating system. And so how do we enable that? How do you maximize the value of that? How do you streamline its usage in all the different places? How do you get through all the friction of using genomics today? Those are all core parts of things Helix tackles. But I think the core kind of animating idea is this idea that it's going to be really a data set versus a test in the future.
Great, 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 excellent, excellent. So maybe digging a little bit deeper into Helix. So it's maybe the best way. It's probably not fair to say it just this way, but Helix, a core component of Helix is a laboratory, which
Mhm.
does the work to be able to take the physical specimens to
Yep.
turn them into digital information.
Yep.
And then I assume there's a component of Helix that is then providing that digital information back to the different health systems. And I'm making it super simple. I'm sure it's
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
incredibly hard, right? You could tell us more about that, right? And then I wonder from there's probably more components to what Helix does, but at the end of the day, like what is the overall business model of the organization? Does the health system that partners with you, do they pay per test, or is it almost like a subscription for a certain amount of population? Maybe you can speak a little bit about
Yeah.
just the business model of Helix.
Yeah. Maybe I'll address the two questions in there.
Yes.
So, um, it sounds great. You have this highfalutin idea, like what you do, right? So what's the practical, block and tackling of it, right? So there are kind of three major things to think about here. So the first part is, as you're saying on the laboratory side, like, can you generate data efficiently at low cost and makes this thing possible, right? And high quality. And Helix operates one of the largest clinical sequencing labs in the US now. We sequence everything there in San Diego. Um, and that's like a core capability of what we do, right? And that also includes things like every use case goes through a clinical review process, it gets signed out, it has all the things you would expect for you to use in the clinical space. And so that all happens because we call that kind of laboratory stack. It's both software, chemistry, and physical footprint, right? The second core thing is like, how do you make it easy to do, right? Like, if you want genomics to be part of the fabric of healthcare, you got to make it as easy to do as order a cholesterol test, right? So, like, how do you embed it in the workflow? How do you make it useful? How do you make sure that people make the right decisions on it? Can you track the outcomes of it? Blah, 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 right? So, that's like a second big bucket, what I would consider like an experience or workflow stack, right? And then the third piece is around data, right? So now that you've generated the data, how do you maximize value of that data? How do you structure more and more research on top of that data? How do you make it available and service it? And so we also, as part of these projects with our health systems, have now built one of the largest EHR plus genomics plus claims databases in the world. I think there's something in there's hundreds of thousands of people who have done this with us over the last couple of years. And so we also manage that component of it and make it available for research as well. Um, so that kind of reflects the what I call like the product stack of Helix. And then if you think about the business models, there are a variety of ways of things getting paid for in healthcare. At least in America, I think we favor the complexity of financing healthcare. So there's components of it which is we work directly with provider systems; they pay us, right? So and that has a variety of different setups. Some of them are fee for service driven. Some of them, as you were alluding to, look much more like subscription ish type scenarios. We have partnerships with payers. Those also reflect either fee for service and or subscription ish type partnerships. And we have partnerships with life sciences, which also have similar ish type arrangements as well. So we actually service what we consider all the parts of healthcare, all the major constituents of healthcare, the care delivery systems, the payers, and the life sciences companies. I think the key thing to think about is everyone benefits in this world from a digital genome, right? No one ever walks around and says, I don't want it to be better, faster, and cheaper, right? So everyone benefits for it. I think the biggest thing that we've been focused on the last couple of years is that everyone wants it, no one wants to pay for it. Right. So like there needs to be a intermediate platform company that's digital first to make that true. And so that's what we do.
Great, great. And I think the one piece to add to that would be the patient's benefit too. At the end of the day, right? So
Totally.
everyone, of course, in the ecosystem
Yes.
benefits from that perspective. And I think is kind of an odd because now that actually maybe we talk a little bit about your partnership with UHN because that may be an example of how both the business and the product function in a real life scenario here that's familiar to all us Canadians that do go to UHN. I know Toronto isn't the center of the world, but we many people Torontonians probably think that way. And so maybe let's talk about your partnership with UHN. I think it's your first partnership outside of the US. How is it
That's right.
similar and different than working with US health systems? I'm curious to get your take.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, so let me see the similarities and maybe differences. So let's start with similarities. I think one is like there's obviously this overarching focus on everywhere, this overarching focus on care delivery and care outcomes, right? And so I think the one thing I always find amazing in healthcare is how many people are working it just to make the patients better, right? How do we help them diagnose, treat, manage disease, and get beyond it so they can live healthy lives? And so I think mission alignment's quite straightforward. With doesn't matter where you are in the world, frankly. I would say there are some peculiarities to the Canadian system that are different, right? National healthcare obviously is a different system. And because of that, the internalization of some of the infrastructure, plus or minus if it's efficient, is something that occurs, I think, on the provincial level in Canada as well. And then there's this quasi private public type arrangements where you're obviously many of these institutions are publicly funded, but there's a private component of what they do. There's a research component that has a little bit of a different setup than we have in the US as well. And then obviously the insurance layer in Canada is there's the public system and then the private system that sits on top of it. So I think just the payment incentive models are slightly different. And so like what we would consider or what we would understand is like, oh, the person is incentivized to do XYZ, not only because of clinical outcomes, but because of payment methods may not exist in Canada. So I think some of the what I consider the behaviors will be different from what we might anticipate here in the US. The other things, which I think are all overcomable, are just like our RRB framework looks slightly different than your REB frameworks and that sort of stuff, and that's fine. Like those are all workable, and same with logistics and shipping and all the other things too. So I think it's more similar than dissimilar. I think the biggest difference is in some of the incentive models.
Actually, maybe let's dig a little bit more into those incentive models because a lot of everyone says this constantly. Incentives drives behavior, right? And
Sure.
our incentive in the for what it is in the US, it's actually quite transparent in the way that people get providers get paid, get billed, they bill. Not to say providers in this case we're talking about healthcare professionals such as doctors and the system that they work for. Not to say they don't care about patients. They do care very very much about
Totally.
patients, but then they need to get paid to survive, and it's very kind of it's understood how they're being paid. In the Canadian system, it is actually much more opaque actually. So what specifically are some challenges that you foresee? Maybe you haven't run into them yet, but you say, hey, you know what? We think this could be a challenge, so we got to mitigate it against by doing something else, right? That we wouldn't have done, say, in partnerships in the U.S. health systems.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are more, I would call, there are certainly some rules and regulations around how things are done at the province level that dictate behaviors plus or minus the rational economics of it, right? So, and that's something we're just learning. We're still learning about, which is like certain things can only be done a certain way because of whatever the province says, versus it actually in the U.S. maybe a medical policy question, right? Or maybe driven by a society, right? A medical society. So, those are some of the things that we come across. I would say that most interesting thing about the Canadian partnership, and one of the reasons why we were really excited about it, though, is that ostensibly the provincial level healthcare system and the way that it's funded is much more focused on outcomes over time, right? So one of the biggest issues in the US system is that we have a problem that we kind of internally call durational mismatch, which is we might all agree it's the right thing to do, but if I don't get my ROI in 3 years, I'm never going to do it, right? And who are the ultimate risk holders in the US, particularly for like say commercial insurance? Well, it's the employers, right? But they're like a couple steps away from the risk, from actually what they view as risk, right? And managing risk. And then ultimately in the US, most of the risk ultimately is owned by the government, right? But they don't really see the risk until you're 65, right? So it's a little bit weird in that like you have this complete disconnection of what I consider early investment, say early in life for healthier outcomes, which would dramatically improve late stage outcomes or later in life outcomes. But you actually don't have a financial connection between the two at all. I think in Canada, you can do that, right? Like you can say if we invested something like genome sequencing for every single person, we would actually be able to attribute value back to the system, right? And so I think that's actually one of the most exciting things that we enjoy about working with the Canadians. At least they have that view of the world versus the hey, this party's going to churn out 20% is going to churn out every year, and so I can only make this thing work in this whatever relevant time frame. So it still works. Like our world, it still works. But I think it is nice to say people can have a long run view of things because health is longitudinal, right? It's not just start and stop depending on when your insurance starts and stops. So
Maybe this is something that apologies for that.
yeah,
We completely skipped this component, but maybe let's like in this case, let's say someone gets a sequencing done at this health system, like let's say UHN,
sure.
in partnership with Helix. Like, what does the patient get out of it? And actually, sometimes it might not even be a patient from the perspective of they're going in to get the test, not necessarily they're actually sick either, right? So
Yeah.
so maybe you can expand upon why genome sequencing is so much more, so powerful for improving
Yeah.
hopefully health
Yeah.
over long term.
Yeah. So maybe I'll cut it different ways. I think the first one is in most of our systems, if you have a population view of your community, so like I'm a health system here, and all the people in this community are actually, hopefully, well, maybe hopefully not, one day patients of me, right? But I own the community's health, and I'm here to help improve that community's health, right? And so what are the things I can keep, what are the things we do, right? You go to your doctor, you tell them some stuff about yourself. They're looking for reasons why maybe they can help you prevent something downstream. So like I eat badly, maybe we should measure your cholesterol, so you may get a statin, whatever, right? And there are fundamental things in the genome that kind of look like this. So like if I knew you had BRCA when you were young, we would manage you differently than if you showed up later with cancer, right? And BRCA is the one of the key genes for BR. It's called BRCA1. It's used. It's a well-known genetic. It's a well-known gene that highly influences whether or not you end up with breast and ovarian cancer. So it turns out, 90% of BRCA carriers mostly are never diagnosed, right? Or they're just not diagnosed typically in typical clinical practice. And even if you happen to have cancer, the rate of testing in that scenario, if you have breast cancer, is something on the order of like 30% relevant to guidelines, right? So it turns out that most people just aren't testing, right? But our management, our both preventive management as well as the disease management, if you happen to have cancer, is completely different, right? And you can do targeted therapeutics. You can prevent the onset of the disease. You can do lots of stuff to manage. So, in our programs, the fundamental thing we do is what we call the screening protocol. The screening protocol is we identify these risks early so we can help you intervene for prevention purposes. So, this is BRCA1 and 2. This is genes related to Lynch syndrome, which is the colorectal syndrome, cancer syndrome, and then genes related to familial hypercholesteremia, which is inherited high cholesterol. And these individuals, most, as I was just saying earlier, mostly missed in clinical practice today, typically have about a 20 times odds ratio relative to the normal population for disease. Something like 30 to 50% of them will be diseased by age 60, right? So just like way higher than normal population. And so we can do things today that help avert that outcome. In the context of UHN, actually, what we're doing is we're offering sequencing to every patient who shows up at UHN. And so that's the fundamental part that we're quite interested in is, cancer as a whole is, I think, increasingly well known as a genetic disease. And that can be both mutations that occur directly in the tissue as well as the things you inherit. And we're just the idea is we can run a universal screening protocol. And that will lead to both, one, better identification of risk, both within that person as well as in their families, right? The second one is it will influence treatment where it can. And the third is we will create a real large research resource to allow us to continue to develop either new therapeutics, new diagnostics, etc. That program at UHN is free of cost, so it's completely free to all patients. They can participate, um, on the first visit. They have to consent as part of that, obviously, because genetic testing requires consent for both treatment and for research. But we're incredibly excited about this approach, which we think is going to be true over time, which is in all of cancer, arguably all of cardiology, and eventually all of people should just be genome sequenced, period. Um,
And the type of sequencing that you do right now
mhm.
looks at a large portion of someone's genome,
Yeah,
and the idea also is that my understanding is, say that there are new insights that come out of it, like through research that could potentially in the future impact, I don't know, lifestyle. It might be even lifestyle in the future,
sure.
right? Or treatment. That because you already did your genome, you already did the sequencing once. You already have that information on hand if something changes and you need to do whatever treatment it may be, right? Is my understanding correct there?
That's right. That's right. So we run something that we call Exome Plus. Um, we're not that great at I mean, we're not that great at naming. I think I named it personally when we first started the company. It was like, well, it's bigger than Exome. It has some other stuff, so we'll call it Exome Plus. It's funny how those things stick with you when you start companies. It's all 22,000 genes. It includes a bunch of stuff in the whole genome. So we pepper the backbone with a bunch of other things to look for non-coding regions. But the key thing is, what else can we do with this, right? And so, I think if you go to the website today, there are 50 plus clinical applications you can use it for. We launch something like 4 to 7 new things every quarter now. And they can be cancer specific or cardiovascular specific or women's health or pharmacogenetics or rare disease or whatnot. So you'll just see us continue to launch new things that people can use across the whole stratum of healthcare. Um, I think the key piece you're saying though is, hey, it's there. If you've been sequenced by Helix anywhere in the U.S. now, and you go see your physician and you need another use case, if you happen to use the Helix provider portal or provider hub to access that, that provider can access that sequence and order from it, right? And what that means is to the both the insurance companies, to the provider, and to the user, one, it's going to be much lower cost. Um, the second one is it can be incredibly fast. So some of our use cases now return in 80 seconds. So we've built a lot of software, you can imagine, to do that. But our view is some of the therapeutic selection points are, how do I make this in the time of the encounter? If my encounter is 5 minutes, I need this to be super fast. And so, God, I don't want you to have to come back 2 weeks from now to titrate your drug. I'm just going to do it right now. So like that's the goal. That's the thing we can solve very narrowly for people is, let's just help you make better decisions every day.
Wow. Okay. Why? I assume not everyone in the US, definitely not Canada, are getting this exome
No,
plus
not yet.
sequencing,
Not yet.
right?
Yeah.
So why do people not? Why do systems not sign up? I guess what pushback do you get? Because this seems like I hate to say a no brainer, but then because I don't want to diminish the challenges groups may have with kind of implementing something like this in their system, but it seems like a no brainer, right? Like what's the pushback?
So the whatever the average time for diffusion of new technology in healthcare is something in the order of decades, right? That's people will say, right? And we're somewhere in that period now, right? Like I think if you look back 10 years ago when we started the company, slightly different. The way we went to market is very different, et cetera. But if you think back to that time frame, like it was like I call like the really early Mavericks phase of this market, right? This like, hey, we're believers. Data is not incontrovertible yet, but there are still people saying, like, I will walk around and say, look, genomics is inevitable. It's an everyone business, and there are a lot of people who say, I don't know if that's true, right? Like, I don't know if it's going to be standard of care, right? Today, I think everyone agrees with that question now. Everyone says, yeah, it will be standard of care. I think their question is when, right? And then we're in like the splitting hairs is 3 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now question, right? And then you're doing the things you have to do now, which is like break down all the barriers, do block and tackling, like all these things you have to do now, because conceptually everyone agrees. But hey, I can generate value by sequencing, but can I capture value because I haven't figured out my economic model? I haven't figured out how to make it easy. I haven't figured out how to capture downstream, blah, 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 blah. So I think that's like if you're the Canadian provincial system, the question isn't, can I run a lab, right? The question is, hey, if I do this thing and the person doesn't get follow up, then I just wasted money, right? So I think that's one of the key things that people have to think about here is the laboratory process is arguably the simplest part now, even though what we're doing there is like astounding physics. Illumina has done astounding physics on that. But at the fundamental level, let's say I tell you you got BRCA, you have a BRCA mutation. Who helps you make sure that you get a mammography every year, right? Like that follow up is how the value accrues, and that's where the work is being done.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you, and I like that you're injecting so much football terminology because it is the Super Bowl coming up very soon, right? I don't know which team. Should I even ask you that question? Do you have a team that's in the Super Bowl that
No, I mean
you're rooting for?
my team exited the playoffs, so
Oh, okay, okay. Who was your team? If you don't
the
mind me asking.
Niners, the 49ers are my team. So
Okay, okay. Yeah, no, I was a big Niners fan. I even had a Niners bomber jersey back in not jersey, jacket back in the day with, Steve Young and Jerry Rice were on the team. That's dating us in general. But this is it's fascinating that you have such a deep, but obviously you have a deep understanding of the science and the clinical aspects because for everyone that doesn't know, James is actually MD PhD, right? And I actually don't know. Do you still practice medicine? Do you still at least get the license every single year, or
No,
no?
I just get text messages of pictures I probably shouldn't see.
Because I was gonna say you are probably you're probably like the Asian parent's dream, right? Like my like both a doctor and you got a PhD,
I don't need to
right?
become a meme. I've seen some of those memes like fighter pilot, Harvard grad. That's not me.
But how? So you change. I don't know if it's really fully changing paths because if for sure you still use a lot of what you probably learned
Yeah.
in med school and
Yeah.
academics, and you take a lot of the a lot of the soft skills of being super persistent, I assume, and perseverance, right, towards this specific big endeavor that you're going on
Yeah.
right now. But maybe a little bit about your origin story. Like, why did you decide to go down this route as opposed to say practicing medicine or running a
Oh
big
yeah.
clinic or so forth?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little bit of like, they say it's like opportunity presents itself to people who are prepared a little bit. So I think the origin story of Helix is quite old now, but it was kind of in the early days of my MD PhD. So I did my MD PhD at Baylor College of Medicine. I did my work with Richard Gibbs, who ran the Human Genome Sequencing Center. It was an amazing place to be at the time. We were sequencing, it was one of the core centers that sequenced the original human genome sequencing project, and then was kind of in the early vanguard of like, what does it look to sequence the next 10 people, the next 100 people, the next 1,000 people. It was also an interesting time in healthcare in America, which is they were just starting to implement digitization of the medical record, right? And so I think the fundamental insight, like kind of in that period, was the genome should live outside the medical record, like the full genome. It should be attached to people so they can carry it, make it interoperable. And there's going to be many, many use cases over time. We just don't know what they are yet. We're just going to make a bet on that case. And that was like, call it the early 2010s, late 2000s, right? And, I was a kind of a computational guy. So, long, long time ago, I was a chemical engineer. I spent my first couple of years in industry at Merck. I went back to do my MD PhD. That I think my biggest decision there was I didn't want to go back into the wet lab, so I was going to do computer science and math. But the second biggest thing I think that was becoming quite obvious then, and certainly is very obvious today, was that biology was going to be a digital enterprise. Like biology was going to get digitized, right? And we're going to focus on it from a data set perspective versus just wet lab, right? And so I decided that, hey, bioinformatics, computational biology, and then machine learning was the thing I was going to focus on. And then when I went to Duke afterwards to join the faculty, that is what I focused on. It was deep learning frameworks for EHR and genetics. Um, so that was the kind of the path, and um, I just think you just follow interesting questions, and the Helix opportunity was something we've been working on for some period of time. It came up, and that's what we did. Um, so
Because right now, it, before we start, had this interview or this podcast episode, you were just coming off of JPM, so that's the JP Morgan Conference for Healthcare,
yeah,
which has kind of become its own thing. Like it felt like it wasn't as big of a thing until like I don't know, last decade and a half or something like that, right? And so I don't. Yeah, I mean, you're obviously much more established, but what was your journey like pitching this idea of yours straight out of? It seems like it was right off of your MD PhD that you founded Helix, or at least very very close to it. So did like to convince others that this was the right approach? Because right now it seems obvious, but I doubt back then it was obvious to people. What was that journey like?
I mean, it wasn't like just me. So there's a lot of serendipity in these things, and so um, my co-founder Justin Cow, who helped me start the company, was at the time at an investment firm that was also looking very deeply at these questions. Had also come to the similar conclusion that like a what we call sequence once query often model was going to be kind of a digital first model was going to be the model of the future, and had also kind of, I think concurrently, Illumina had also gotten to that conclusion as well. And so happened to be that we were able to put the whole thing together. And aluminum was one of the early investors in the company, which made it possible at a time when, this is a decade ago, right? Like the technology was much less higher, as it was then super high throughput, but compared to today, it was definitely not, right? And you need a financial backer and the syndicated investors to put in money. And so a lot of things just kind of came together. I mean, it was still challenging, right, to get it done. It's like a major strategic, a major financial core idea, right? But I think it was, I mean, I don't have a better word than serendipity. Like a lot of things came together in such a way that it became possible.
Yeah. Now, sometimes I completely understand, like you suggested, it's some people would say luck, but luck is really you put yourself in the position that you can then capture that opportunity. And it seems like that did come together for yourself and your other co-founders and the entire organization. Now, actually, we talked about the various things that kind of make up Helix in terms of the various components, that the big pillars, to say the three big pillars you're talking about: data, workflow, and then also, I believe, the lab stack as well, right? Which is we say these in very simple words. You use very simple words to describe them, but obviously incredibly complex. So, how do you, for other entrepreneurs, let's say they're trying to break into healthcare, right? You have done something that I say it's like a monumental lift. Like, you did not build an app. It would have been, not to say an app isn't useful. You didn't build an app, right? You built this this big machine, almost like a factory, almost, right? So, like, how, how did you have the almost like motivation to do that? I assume it was an incredibly big lift, right? Did you just have conceptually everything in your head already, or was it something else like that allowed you to get to this point that you guys are at right now?
I mean, there's a lot of people who provide a lot of thinking into these early stages, how you put a business together. I think the fundamental concepts, are quite easy to grok, especially today, right? Like, oh, this is what we're going to do. This is our thesis of the world. But how do you get from point A to point B I think a good portion of it is dictated by the resources around you and then what's possible in the world, right? So if you think back a decade ago, right? So you want to build an engine that enables digital first genomes everywhere at very large scale. The scale capability didn't exist, right? Like it wasn't like you could go somewhere and just get it, right? Um, when we were building infrastructure, we were cloud first. When we started the company, cloud first was controversial, right? In our space, like most people bought servers, right? Most people actually recommended we buy servers, right? So you kind of have to do what's possible. So why do we build a giant lab? Well, we had to, right? It turns out having that capability is incredibly important today because we control our own destiny in terms of quality and cost. I don't know if I would have known that in 2015. Theoretically, you knew that, right? You're like, oh, of course that would be true, but our business is not possible today without that capability, right? And so I just think it's a little bit of some of it is just the path dependency of the business. And so you end up where you are, and then you're constantly adjusting to where your strengths are. And so what we've done is we've taken an incredible lab capability, have built additional capabilities around it, around workflow and data and these other things. And so, but it is still kind of the centerpiece, which is if we didn't have that today and our cost structure around it, it just wouldn't be possible to do the rest. It would just be a different business, right? I'm not sure I would recommend a high capital requirement business day one, but I think it depends on the idea, right? It's not like people are afraid of high capital businesses today, and the funding environment is such that you can fund. I mean, look at the AI companies, right? I mean, like the capital requirements of those businesses is insane. The revenue ramp is insane, also, right? But no one's blinking at the capital requirement if they believe the opportunity is there. So I do think it's a little bit of what are you trying to accomplish? And the one thing about capital requirements is they do create moats. So if you can turn that capital into something that's demonstrative capability that cannot be easily replicated, it is a real moat. And software today, I think, is much less of a moat than it was a year or two ago. So
Yeah. How about moving forward now for Helix? the of course you just brought up, I think everyone's drinking game word of AI, right? Everyone should drink when someone says AI nowadays, right? Is what sort of nicks for Helix? I know it probably, if everyone adopted Helix and the sequencing exome plus sequencing, that would be obviously a really
Mhm.
incredibly big lift. But let's say that was the case already, right? Let's say people everywhere got exome plus sequencing,
Mhm.
right? What would be next for Helix? Do you add then more modalities, or do you use like AI to potentially provide more insights?
Yeah.
What do you think is next?
Yeah. So these are all interesting questions, right? And um, so I think there are two ways to think about it, right? There are two ways to think about it, and I think the two avenues you sketched out, which are like, hey, I'm going to go more omics, or I'm going to go basically drive new insight. Those are kind of two ways to think about what I call like growth vectors of the organization, assuming you get more scale on more people coming through and all this other stuff, right? I think the the underlying fundamental question though is what is maximal information content? Is my view. So um, information, lots of things come at you all the time, and some of those things are relevant, some are not, and many of those data points are duplicative, right? And it turns out the genome we think is orthogonal to lots and lots of stuff in healthcare, and is a leading signal for many things in healthcare. And so that's why we also think of it as a fundamental core data set because its information content independently is very high, right? So what can we do with that now? Well, if we have other clinical data, like other laboratory tests or other diagnostic codes or experience in the healthcare system, can we build more complicated, more sophisticated, more accurate algorithms to help predict? I think the answer is clearly yes, right? That is already happening. And our view of that is that's actually probably the right way to think of genetics in the future, which is less of the I have a gene with a variant binary versus the genetic information is complementary to and improves or drives a prediction that is better than I have without it, right? And we think that framework works for almost everything in healthcare. Whether or not you're doing prognostics, you're doing diagnostics, you're doing screening, like it works for almost every single application. You will find that genetics added to something else is almost always better. So that's like one key avenue. And then the second question, omics, my question always is, does it provide information I cannot get anywhere else now, right? And the reason we think about this, and I think you're starting to see in the market, is the data mining tools have gotten so sophisticated that you can train on specific outcomes. And so I'll just give the example. Sometimes you can actually get tumor genetic markers by analyzing the pathology image, right? And sometimes you actually get a better predictor in the pathology image than running a genetic test, right, for that tumor. So if I'm a company that owns the genetic marker test, right, am I in trouble, right? And I think that's a fundamentally interesting question because if I'm a payer and I'm paying for clinical outcome, if the information content is duplicative, I'm going to do the thing effectively that's free, which is run the image analysis, right? So I think you have to have an information content first view of the world, and then you look at complements. So when we think about the other omics stack, the question I have is what is incremental to the information content we have available already? And that dictates the way we move versus, hey, I think today transcriptomics is super sexy or proteomics is super sexy or whatnot. That may be true for research purposes. From a clinical delivery perspective over time, my view is the most efficient thing for patients, providers, and the payer. That is ultimately typically what wins, even if it's a lot of friction along the way.
Yeah. Actually, that's a good, very complicated
Very
question,
complicated
right?
answer.
No, no, no. It's it's great. I love the way that you're kind of running through it, and it's almost like in a very fundamental way. And how do you layer on sort of the, I would say maybe this might not be the right term, but let's say value to the various stakeholders, right?
Yeah.
Do you always put, say, like patient, let's say the industries that then also support this entire endeavor as well, the providers, insurance companies, how do you balance that, or is it always just patient first? despite perhaps the information that's generated, let's say, doesn't have any utility outside of treating that patient in terms of research. Like I doubt that's the case, but let's say that was the case. Would it always be patient first?
Yeah. I mean, I think the patient first filter is like the baseline requirement, right? Like if it's not net good, meaningfully net good for patients, kind of what's the point is my view. I don't know if everyone in healthcare shares that view, but certainly my view is that like I don't want to work on things that are very marginal, right? We're here to make patients' lives much better, right? And so that's our baseline filter for almost everything. And then the second question then is like, how does it go to market, right? And so that's a question of incentives. And there are many ways to make the incentives work in the US system, right? Like sometimes the incentives are it's good for the patients, but it's also good for the provider, right? From a reimbursement perspective, right? So maybe that's the sale point, right? Or maybe it's really good for the payer, but not so good for the provider. So how do you get them to adopt, right? So that's a different go to market. Or it's like really good for the life sciences company because the drug might be amazing and expensive, but like really bad for the payer, and then arguably really bad for the patient from a copay perspective, right? So they're just complex financial arrangements that you have to think through, just to see if when you go to market, like does it make sense and who do you sell to and how do you get it on board and stuff. And they require different things over time depending on what the segment is. But I think fundamentally, if it doesn't help the patient, then what's the point, right?
No, no, absolutely. Maybe I know you're super busy, so I very much appreciate the time. Maybe just a last question
Sure.
before we kind of sign off today is, let's say Helix is super successful in achieving the mission and the vision that you have set forth, or you and your team have set forth, right? And I don't know, say 5 years, 10 years, whatever time frame you want to use. Like, what does
Sure.
healthcare look like when that time kind of when you guys can say, hey, we've succeeded.
Um, so maybe I'll start at the very base level, which is you're probably fundamentally saving tens of thousands of lives every year, just like on a very basic basis, if not hundreds of thousands of lives every year. And we can say that because genomics is so underutilized today that if we're actually using it to its full extent, we will be just saving net new lives, period. Right. The second piece of it is that we will have fundamentally made this transition towards this data is now ubiquitous and easy to use. And so we hopefully from a mindset are moving from a place of maybe scarcity, which is this is so expensive and so few people do it and esoteric, to something of abundance, which is this is everywhere, it's low cost and can be used for many, many things. Right. And I think we are going to shift, and the framework I think we use a little bit on this is we will shift from a world where the phenotype, we call a phenotype first model to a genotype first model. So a phenotype first model is I go to the doctor's office and they ask me some questions, right? And the cheapest way to assess someone's risk is the typical questions you get asked, which is how old are you? What's your gender at birth? Have you fallen down anytime soon? What happened in your family, right? Like that's the reason they ask those questions because it turns out every risk algorithm starts with your age and your sex and your ethnicity and then some other things, right? You can tell a lot of person about risk if you have age, right? I think you will switch to a model which is genome first, which is we'll have age and sex still, but your genome will be the fundamental data set. And then you will ask questions relevant to that based on your underlying risk, right? And I will posit already that the genome is cheaper than a physician visit. Like we're already in the paradigm. The question is, I can't capture the value of the genome there yet, so I don't know how to do that yet, right? But inevitably, we are in that transition today. And so, in 5 or 10 years from now, that will be obvious, I think, to everyone. And so we'll be kind of moving along that way. It'll make healthcare way more efficient. It'll be like way lower cost. People will have access to the data, like just like you have access to everything on your phone. We're just not there yet. But I think that is what ubiquity feels like. And maybe the last piece I will say is hopefully Helix will become a major engine of research innovation. So one of our partnership structures is that if you're a partner with us in the healthcare system space on the research network, you also can drive your own research with that data. And so we're incredibly excited about things like UHN researchers leveraging the scale of our partnerships to drive their own discovery, because no single system is big enough on its own. So we're trying to put them all together. I think there's power in the the networks, both on a data perspective, but also just the human perspective of people working together closely on these things. And if we can just make everything a little bit faster because these things are easy to do from a research perspective, that would be great for everyone. So
Amazing, amazing, awesome. I hope you're absolutely right. I mean, the I love the idea of for right now moving towards this idea of abundance, right? There's abundance of information, not just, but then that information turns into kind of abundance of insight. So, with that said, thank you again, James, for jumping on the podcast
of
and
course,
educating all the Canadians out here. This fantastic relationship and partnership you have with the UHN. I hope this becomes I hope this gives everyone else a kick in the behind, all the other provinces to have a similar type of partnership, right? Because I don't see why this type of benefit isn't so, it so seems so obvious, right? It seems like everyone should be going down this route. Of course, I know there's certain hurdles that need to be jumped through, but if people do want to reach out to you, right, what is the best way to do that? Do you have I'm just looking at your, so obviously there's helix.com, so helix.com. Your group seems to also have a Twitter at, or sorry, X Twitter at
yeah,
my
yeah,
underscore helix, right? What's the best way to contact you, James?
yeah. I mean, through the website, we're on all the social things. We're on LinkedIn. Any of those will work. So feel free, and yeah, we love to be in every province in Canada. So if anyone's listening, I think we're happy to have that conversation. So I think this will be inevitably a universal approach. I think it is, and everyone will get sequenced out inevitably at some point.
Appreciate that. Thank you again for jumping on the
Of course.
podcast. Thank you, everyone else, for listening and watching this podcast. If you have any questions, any comments, feel free to put them down below. And of course, thumbs up and subscribe. Thanks a lot and have a great rest of your day. Appreciate it. Thanks, James.
Thank you, Buster.